We'd like to welcome you to our first podcast under the auspices of the Bombay Jazz Club, our series of podcasts entitled Music for Good. Our guest today is Warren Senders, an American Hindustani vocalist and climate change activist. He's doing some amazing environmental work with his music playing an integral role. So welcome, Warren. Glad to have you here today.
Pleasure to be here.
So we're really curious about how you first got to India and how your learning began here.
At some point fairly early on in my life, it became clear that I was very attracted to music, to the whole continuum of organized sound. I found it all interesting, and I especially liked things that weren't predictable. I discovered jazz when I was 14 years old. The first thing that I heard that turned me on in the world of jazz was Charles Mingus's record, The Clown, which has improvised narration by the great humorist and monologuist Gene Shepard. And so that excited me enormously. And then through that, I began listening to a local radio station and developed a friendship with the person who ran the jazz program late at night. Our old mutual friend, Steve Ellman, who, by the way, sends his warm regards to you. Yeah, so it set the stage for me being taken far seriously than I really deserved.
Okay.
But because I had been reading Downbeat magazine very assiduously, our high school library, for reasons unknown to me, subscribed to Downbeat magazine. As far as I could tell, I was the only person who ever read it. I had acquired quite a good historical background. It's in my nature. When I get interested in something, I get every book that I can on it, read everything 7 or 8 times, and internalize the information. This stood me in good stead later on when I became involved in the world of Hindustani music. And at any rate, Steve Ellman, our mutual friend, he invited me to come in and visit him at his place of work in Boston during the day, and he worked at an organization called the Schwann Record Catalog that was responsible for documenting all of the LPs that had been released in the United States during a particular time period. So I came in to visit him one day. I think must have been during my summer vacation, and he pointed at a wall of LPs, just 50 feet long and 14 feet high, all these shelves filled with LPs, and said, "Help yourself." And it turned out that he'd already taken the jazz, and I wasn't really interested in the pop, and his office mate had taken the classical, and what was really left was a large selection of what was then called ethnic music. And that ranged everything from Native American tribal chants that had been recorded by Francis Densmore on a cylinder recorder in 1902 and redocumented on Folkways records to, Afghani urban songs and Turkish ritual dances and fertility chants of Papua New Guinea and God knows what else. And because I was just curious, I just kept pulling this stuff out, and he was very happy enough to have me walk out with all these records. So I built quite a library of what subsequently became called world music, well before I had graduated from high school.
So, Warren, how did you find your calling for Hindustani classical music? It's not a very mainstream idea in the United States, this esoteric art form from India. How did you get started on this journey?
I was already marked as an anomaly in high school. And somewhere around a year or so after I'd graduated from high school, I had returned from one of these visits, and among the recordings that I had taken was a recording of Indian orchestral music, light Indian orchestral music composed by Pandit Ravi Shankar. And so I put on that recording and really enjoyed it enormously. And there was a vocal interlude, a tarana in Rag Kirwani that had some short improvisations, including a taan sung by Lakshmi Shankar. And I just went, what is that? I've got to do that. And it was in the course of that, on one of these days, that I met my first teacher, who was an Indian woman, Kalpana Majumdar, who was performing with the U.S. Steel Cello Ensemble. And I went up to her in all my long-haired, blue-jeaned glory and said, I want to study with you. And she looked, I think, a little skeptical, but we agreed that I could start lessons. And it was right around that time that I began both my work in the study of Hindustani music and my work in higher education as a college student. I had always been influenced by the music of Bhimsen Joshi. I was very, very impressed by his singing. I'd had a chance to hear him perform when he was in Boston in 1982 and was tremendously moved by that performance. And I was in the process of applying for grants to come to India and to do study. So I wrote him a letter and asked if I could come and study with him. And eventually I sent him a tape of a performance, and he agreed. He agreed that I could come and study with him. And I got a grant. And that was in 1985, and I traveled to India in the September of 1985 and set up residence in Pune and began trying to have lessons with Bhimsenji. But it soon became apparent that it was not really an ideal match of teacher to student. He was a brilliant performer who was not someone who'd put in a lot of time in teaching. And he was not really equipped to handle the learning requirements of someone who did not come from an Indian music background. And so his usual methodology was just to tell his students, come to my concerts, play tambura for me, record my concerts, listen to my music, and that way you'll learn what you want. But that was not something that I could do that would provide the right kind of guidance. And after a number of months during which I was getting increasingly frustrated, and there's no disrespect for Bhimsenji's music or his genius, but it was just clear that my needs as a student were not being met, and I was not sufficiently indoctrinated into the authoritarian mindset of Guru Shishya Parampara to simply say, I'll go along with this for as long as it takes. I didn't have as long as it took. And one of the people I had been working with and talking to in Pune was Rajiv Devastali, who was the son of Sri Ram Devastali. And at one point, I'd been talking to him about my situation with Bhimsenji, and he said to me, Warren, my dad wants to meet you. So it was in early 1986 when I first met Sri Ram Devastali, my guru. And he gave me a lengthy interview and wanted to know what I had learned with Bhimsenji and what my aspirations were in Indian music. And I said, which I think impressed him very greatly, I said, I want to sing in the mehfil. I want to sing in house concerts. Because it had become my view that the small listening audience, the house concert, was the ideal format for the music. It was where the music had its finest flowering. And that pleased him. And he rolled up his sleeves. It was a very vivid gesture. And he said, we can do it, but you'll have to work very hard. And at that point, I'd been doing very rigorous practice, but I didn't have much of a sense of what to practice. And he directed me to the music room at Muktangan and said, get started and warm up. And so I did. And then he came in a few minutes later and began singing with me. And it was pure paramparic talim. It was absolutely traditional. He would sing a phrase and wait for me to sing it back, and then mutated a little bit, and he kept doing that. And this went on for 4 hours.
Wow.
And that was almost 4 hours more instruction than I had gotten up to that point of all my time in India. Bhimsenji had given me 2 actual face-to-face lessons, each one lasting between 15 and 20 minutes. So he gave me a 4-hour lesson, and then his niece arrived in the doorway and said, "Where have you been? Your dinner is cold." And he looked at his watch and realized that it was 11 o'clock at night and said, "Are, come back tomorrow, same time." So I came back tomorrow, and he gave me another 4-hour lesson. And I came back the day after that, and he gave me another 4-hour lesson. And pretty much, I don't think he ever ate a hot dinner during that first year. He refused to accept any money of any kind, even on Guru Purnima. He got very upset if I tried to give him money. He said, "All I ask is that you practice hard."
Warren, what were the challenges you faced as an American learning Hindustani classical music?
Over that time, I was getting more and more fluent in the language of Hindustani music and gradually overcoming the early deficiencies, both in my musicianship and in my capacity to handle the particular requirements of Hindustani music. It's recognized by anyone in India who's had this experience that Americans are notoriously bad at differentiating between the short and the long sounds. Everything gets mishmashed together.
Right.
So and we don't know the difference between those. And and
Yeah.
these types of phonemes, they're not part of the American English linguistic hardwiring. So it requires a great deal of practice for us to develop the skill in doing that. And Devastali Boy used to drill me on the pronunciations. Sometimes words would be split in incorrect locations, or vowel sounds would be distorted. But invariably, those were idiomatic mistakes. And if I made a mistake, it would be a non-Indian mistake, and it would be a glaring indicator. So I wound up actually being forced by necessity to be even more scrupulous in my handling of the song text than many of my peers in the world of Hindustani music in Pune at that time.
Considering your supreme dedication to Hindustani music, do you continue to work as a composer and performer in the world of jazz and contemporary Western music?
This was all happening side by side with my original music work. I was recording and performing with the Indian version of Anti-Gravity and taking some of the same compositions I'd been performing in America in the early 1980s, and now doing them in the recording studio and writing new material as well for the Indian ensemble. At one point, Guruji asked me, he said, "Why do you do this? Isn't Hindustani music enough? It's so vast." And it's a very good question, but it's a mark of his liberality of temperament that he asked me the question rather than simply saying, "Don't do that." Because, you know, the old style pundits and ustads, they weren't interested in what you had to say. But he was interested. And I said, "Well, Guruji, you speak many different languages. Do you not find it the case that a concept which is almost impossible to express in one language becomes clear and easy to express in another language?" And he said, "Oh, of course. There are ideas which are native to Marathi, which take hours of explanation in English, and vice versa." And I said, "It is like that for me in music. I have ideas in music which I can only express in the language of khayal, but I also have ideas which khayal cannot express adequately and which can only be expressed in the language of jazz. And again, to his enormous credit, he was silent for a few seconds and he said, "That makes perfect sense. Thank you for explaining that." And then after that, he was unfailingly supportive of my work in musical synthesis. And I like to think also that his pedagogy and his dedication to teaching me became a major influence in how I wound up becoming an environmental activist.
Well, now we're coming to a very important facet of yourself. Warren, tell us about how you evolved to becoming a champion for the environment as the man with the sign and your use of music to do so.
It became evident to me that for my own survival as a person of conscience, that I had to begin acting and to begin work as an activist. And since 2009, I revised my description of myself to put environmental activist first and musician second. In my concerts, I will speak directly on the issue of climate change to the audiences. In my online performances, I do that. In my daily activist work as a man with a sign standing by the roadside, I combine the singing and the work of standing and keeping vigil and acting as or acting in a practice of conscience to reiterate the message that climate change is real and a danger to us all.
Where do you think jazz and other contemporary forms of music are headed right now?
The nature of jazz's origin, of adaptation under adverse circumstances to a wide variety of complex musical influences that were all surrounding the Black American population at the turn of the 20th century, it created an adaptivist mindset that allowed all of these influences to be assimilated without causing the music to lose its identity, its characteristic flexibility of perspective. And so we have jazz musicians from all over the world who found that the African diasporic traditions speak to them in a way that allows their own musical visions to flourish. And it's odd. I think the only other place where that's happened, and it's also, I think, an African diasporic tradition, we find that the genres of rap music have found wide adaptation all over the world. There are Inuit rappers.
Yeah.
There are rappers in Tagalog and in all the African languages, and in Indonesian languages. There are rappers in Arabic. There are French rappers and Spanish rappers and Portuguese rappers, and I'm pretty sure there are Hebrew rappers and Yiddish rappers, and it's recognizably rap. It's not something that I listen to personally, but I'm delighted by the fact that it exists. I remember reading a few years ago that rap in Tagalog in the Philippines had become a sanctioned vehicle for community protest.
Yes.
Local radio stations that people could go in and they could vent their frustrations with the local government over pre-recorded hip-hop tracks, and that this was now very much a part of the idiom. And I thought, wow, that's great, and of course I know that there's rap in a lot of Indian languages. Haven't heard any Sanskrit rap, but I'm sure it's out there somewhere. So as to where jazz is headed, it's not headed in any one direction. It's headed in a lot of different directions now. Me personally, my own jazz practice right now, I'm practicing a lot of swing tunes and early New Orleans tunes because I like them so much. But I'm under no illusions that that's where the music is heading. I'm just practicing that because it's fun. 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 and I did it not.